Hi everyone. Okay, so I read everyone's responses and I just wrote down a few things. So to start off, I noticed that Emily talked about the style and the writing of the story. Um, the original copy of On the Road is written in scroll text, so when it was finished, it was basically just a long piece of paper that had text on it, and so it kind of looked like a road when you laid it out because it was super long. And this kind of represents how Jack and his friends traveled across the country on the road. And Jack's narrating the story, so he was telling his point of view of the story as he traveled down the road. And as the readers, we saw it through the book that we read, his journey through the road. New York and the East Coast represented the old Jack, where he was sad, lonely, and depressed. And then he traveled to the West on the road, and during the journey, he was really happy. As he got closer and closer to the West, he was becoming more happier and joyful, and he kind of described his journeys as being pure. So basically, it just kind of represented Jack through the layout of the book and made him who he is today, or at the time when he wrote the story. Okay. So Anna talked about the theme of the West and East. Jack saw the West as a wild culture, and he really looked up to Neil, who he was traveling with, and was really envious of Neil. And he saw Neil as being someone who was wild and lived just this crazy life. And so he kind of figured that if he journeyed over to the West, he'd be exposed to exploration and adventure, which is a lot like how he saw Neil. So he thought maybe that he would become someone like Neil. And in the story, Neil was represented by someone as Dean, so it's the same person. But once he got to the West, he found out the West was nothing like the dream that he wanted to live, and it was basically just a myth and pretty empty. It was basically all highways and busy and just not fun. So he travels back to the East, where he started to gain reality of himself and what the world is. And then Zoe talked about the role of the female and how it's underestimated, but yet steers and drives the men in the story to different places, and they travel and they serve kind of as a symbol in the story. So the first character, Jack, he's unhappy. He goes to the West to find happiness. He travels. As he's traveling, he engages in sex with a lot of females, and he still, though, leaves them because he's not happy with himself. And then Neil, who's another character, he cheated on his first wife because he was unhappy. And then he married a girl named Camille, who's who he cheated on his wife with. And they have a child, and he still leaves her and the daughter because he's unhappy. And then lastly, he meets Diana, and they have a child together, and he leaves because he's still unhappy. So in the story, women are seen as insignificant, but yet men are seen as careless and having no emotion, but yet they can still, it seems like they can get away with it in the story without anyone thinking anything. When in reality, the women really control them, and they're kind of the ones that are pushing Dean and Jack away to leave and travel on the road. And this shows kind of how they are symbolizing the drive for happiness and travel. And then my entry talked about more about the freedom that was in the story. I noticed throughout the story, the freedom that Jack and Neil and them had, they were basically able to get away with anything. I mean, they could drive down the road and drink. Could leave these women, have children with these people, and still pack up and leave. So they were really just using the freedom that they had the best that they could as they traveled through America. And America is known as is a country that has freedom. So I just thought that was really interesting how they were using their freedom, but it was kind of for the wrong reasons. So after reading everyone's responses, I came up with 2 questions. And my first question is, freedom seemed to be a theme in the story. With freedom, a person can find their individuality. How are the characters how are the characters' individuality displayed in the novel? And then my second question is, this novel is a scroll text and is narrated by Jack about his journeys. How does time play a role in this novel and throughout the journey when they're on the road? And those are my questions.